What if I told you a little bit of radiation might actually be good for you? Not neutral, not harmless, but potentially beneficial. Sounds crazy, right? We're taught that any radiation is dangerous, that there is no safe amount. But what if that's only half the story? Today, we're diving into one of the most controversial ideas in science, radiation hormesis. When most people hear radiation, they think of Chernobyl, atomic bombs, cancer. And yes, high doses of radiation are absolutely dangerous. But the real question is, does every dose increase your risk? Or could tiny doses actually activate protective systems in your body? Let's break it down. Radiation. It's a word that carries weight. The moment we hear it, something inside us tightens. We imagine disaster, invisible danger, long-term damage. But here's something most people don't realize. Radiation is not rare. It's not exotic. It's not only found in nuclear reactors or atomic bombs. Radiation is everywhere. Right now, as you're watching this, tiny particles from outer space are passing through your body. Cosmic rays constantly rain down on Earth. The ground beneath your feet contains naturally radioactive elements like uranium and thorium. Even the air you breathe contains trace amounts of radon gas. And yes, even the food you eat. Bananas contain potassium, and a small fraction of that potassium is naturally radioactive. It's called potassium-40. This isn't science fiction. This is normal life on Earth. In fact, every human being receives background radiation every single day just by existing. So if radiation is natural, why are we so afraid of it? The answer lies in history. In the 20th century, the world witnessed events that reshaped public perception forever. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the disaster at Chernobyl, later the accident at Fukushima. These were not small exposures. They were massive, catastrophic doses of radiation, and the consequences were devastating. Cancer rates increased. Communities were displaced. Land became uninhabitable. Radiation became synonymous with invisible death, understandably so. But here's where science steps in. After World War II, researchers needed a model to estimate cancer risk from radiation exposure. They studied survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki people who had experienced extremely high doses. From this data, scientists developed what is now known as the linear no-threshold model, often shortened to LNT. The idea is straightforward. If a high dose of radiation increases cancer risk by a certain amount, then half that dose increases the risk by half as much. A quarter dose increases it by a quarter as much. And critically, there is no safe threshold. Even the smallest dose, according to this model, carries some risk. It may be tiny. It may be statistically hard to measure. But it is not zero. This model is simple. It is mathematically clean. And most importantly, it is cautious. Because when dealing with something that can cause cancer, caution matters. Today, radiation protection agencies around the world, from medical imaging guidelines to nuclear plant regulations, base their standards on the LNT model. It shapes how X-rays are used, how CT scans are justified, how nuclear waste is stored, how cleanup operations are conducted after accidents. It is the backbone of global radiation safety. But here's the deeper question. The data that built this model came from high-dose exposure. So what happens at extremely low doses, the kind we experience naturally every day? Is the relationship truly linear all the way down to zero? Or does biology behave differently at tiny levels? Because the human body is not a passive object. It is dynamic, adaptive, constantly repairing itself. Every day, your DNA is damaged, not just by radiation, but by normal metabolism, by sunlight, by chemicals in food. And every day, your cells repair that damage with astonishing precision. So, the debate begins here. Is low-dose radiation simply a smaller version of high-dose harm? Or is something more complex happening at the microscopic level? For decades, the assumption has been clear. All radiation is harmful. More radiation means more risk, and less is always better. But some scientists quietly question whether that assumption tells the whole story. Not because radiation is harmless, not because nuclear disasters weren't tragic, but because biology, as we continue to discover, is rarely as simple as a straight line. And that's where the conversation gets interesting. To understand radiation hormesis, we first need to understand a simple but profound biological principle, hormesis. Hormesis is the idea that a small amount of stress can make a living system stronger. At first, that sounds contradictory. Stress is supposed to harm us, damage us, wear us down. But biology tells a more nuanced story. Your body is not fragile, it is adaptive. And adaptation often begins with challenge. Think about exercise. The first time you lift heavy weights, you don't get stronger in that moment. You actually create microscopic damage in your muscle fibers. It's stress, it's strain, it's disruption. But then something remarkable happens. Your body responds, it repairs the fibers, it reinforces them. It prepares for the next challenge. And when that challenge comes again, you're stronger. Not in spite of the stress, but because of it. The same pattern appears in many areas of life. When you fast for a short period, your body doesn't collapse. Instead, it activates repair pathways. Cells begin cleaning up damaged components in a process called autophagy. When you expose yourself to cold briefly and safely, your body increases circulation, efficiency, and metabolic activity to adapt. Even the vegetables you eat contain mild natural toxins. Plants produce these chemicals as defense mechanisms. In large amounts, they could be harmful. But in tiny amounts, they stimulate antioxidant production in your cells. They trigger protective pathways. They strengthen resilience. In each case, the pattern is the same, small stress. Biological response. Improved resistance. This is hormesis. It's not about reckless exposure. It's not about ignoring danger. It's about dose. Too little stress and the system becomes weak. Too much stress and the system breaks. But somewhere in the middle, there can be growth. Now pause for a moment. If exercise works this way, if fasting works this way, if plant compounds work this way, why wouldn't radiation at very low levels possibly follow a similar pattern? This is the central idea behind radiation hormesis. The hypothesis suggests that low doses of radiation may act as a tiny biological signal, not enough to overwhelm the system, not enough to cause large-scale damage, but enough to wake up the body's defense mechanisms. Because here's something crucial. Your DNA is not sitting idle, waiting to be destroyed. It is constantly being damaged and repaired thousands of times per day. By normal metabolism, by sunlight, by natural chemical reactions inside your cells. Your body already has powerful repair systems in place. Enzymes patrol your DNA. Proteins detect breaks. Cells with severe damage are often programmed to self-destruct through apoptosis, a controlled form of cellular suicide that protects the larger organism. These systems evolved in a world where background radiation has always existed. Life on Earth has never known zero radiation. So the hormesis argument asks, could small doses act like a practice round for your cells? A gentle trigger that activates repair systems so that when real damage occurs, the body is even more prepared? Some laboratory studies suggest this might happen. Low-dose radiation has been observed in certain experiments to increase DNA repair activity, to stimulate antioxidant defenses, to enhance immune surveillance. In these control settings, cells sometimes appear more resilient after tiny exposures compared to no exposure at all. But this is where careful thinking matters. Hormesis does not claim radiation is harmless. It does not claim more is better. In fact, Hormesis depends entirely on limits. Just like lifting weights, 5 kilograms may build strength. 500 kilograms will crush you. The difference is dose. And that's what makes radiation hormesis so controversial and so fascinating. It challenges the idea that risk always increases in a straight line from zero. Instead, it suggests a curve, harm at high levels, possible benefit at very low levels, and a narrow window where adaptation may occur. It's a subtle idea. It requires precision. It requires humility. It requires acknowledging that biology is rarely simple. But if hormesis is real, even partially, it means our relationship with radiation is not just about fear. It's about understanding thresholds, understanding adaptation, and understanding that sometimes, in the right dose, stress does not weaken life. It sharpens it. So what does the evidence actually say? Not opinions, not fear, not philosophy. Evidence. Let's begin in the laboratory. In controlled experiments, scientists have exposed cells and animals to very low doses of radiation doses, far below those known to cause acute harm. And something interesting sometimes happens. Instead of observing increased damage, researchers have seen signs of activation. DNA repair enzymes become more active. Antioxidant production increases. Cells begin expressing protective proteins. In some experiments, cells that received a tiny dose of radiation were later better able to survive a larger dose compared to cells that had never been exposed at all. It's almost like a biological rehearsal, a small signal, a preparation phase, a strengthening response. Some studies have even reported lower mutation rates in low-dose groups compared to completely unexposed controls. That doesn't prove benefit, but it complicates the simple narrative that any radiation is always harmful. Now step outside the laboratory. What about real populations? There are regions of the world where natural background radiation is significantly higher than the global average, not due to nuclear accidents, not due to industrial contamination, but due to geology. One of the most cited examples is Ramsar, a coastal city in northern Iran. In certain neighborhoods of Ramsar, natural radiation levels can be several times in some spots, even dozens of times higher than typical global background levels. This radiation comes from naturally occurring radium in the hot springs and surrounding rock. And yet, when researchers examined cancer rates in these populations, they did not find dramatic increases. Some small studies even suggested slightly lower cancer incidence in certain groups, though those findings are debated. Ramsar isn't alone. Other high background radiation areas exist in parts of India, Brazil, and China. In many of these regions, long-term residents appear to live normal lifespans without obvious spikes in radiation-linked cancers. Now, this is the moment where caution becomes essential. Because absence of obvious harm is not proof of benefit. Population studies are messy. People don't live in controlled laboratory conditions. Diet varies. Genetics vary. Healthcare access varies. Environmental exposures vary. When sample sizes are small, as they often are in high radiation regions, statistical noise can easily distort conclusions. Some scientists argue that these studies lack the power to detect small increases in cancer risk. Others suggest that migration patterns complicate the data. People who develop serious illness may move away, subtly skewing long-term statistics. There is also the healthy survivor effect, the idea that those who remain in such regions may not represent the full original population. And importantly, many of these studies observe relatively modest radiation elevations compared to catastrophic exposure levels seen in nuclear disasters. So critics say the evidence is intriguing but not definitive. Supporters respond, if the linear no-threshold model were perfectly accurate, we would expect at least measurable increases in cancer rates in these high natural radiation zones. Yet, we don't consistently see that. And so the debate continues. Laboratory studies suggest adaptive responses are biologically plausible. Epidemiological observations raise important questions, but neither side has produced evidence strong enough to completely silence the other. And this is what makes radiation hormesis such a persistent scientific controversy. It doesn't collapse under scrutiny, but it doesn't stand unchallenged either. It exists in the gray zone between fear and reassurance, between caution and curiosity. What we can say with certainty is this: high doses of radiation damage DNA faster than the body can repair it. That is well established. What remains uncertain is what happens at the very lowest levels. The levels that brush gently against our biology rather than overwhelm it. Does the body simply accumulate microscopic harm, or does it respond, adapt, and fortify itself? Science has not yet drawn a final line, but the evidence is strong enough to keep the question alive. And sometimes, in science, the most important progress begins not with certainty, but with a well-asked question. If radiation hormesis were proven true beyond doubt, it would not be a small scientific update. It would be a paradigm shift. For more than half a century, global radiation policy has been built on one foundational assumption: the linear no-threshold model. The idea that risk increases steadily from zero, that no dose is completely safe, that less is always better. This model guides everything. It shapes how doctors think about X-rays and CT scans. It influences nuclear power plant regulations. It determines how governments clean up contaminated land. It even affects how much radiation workers are legally allowed to receive. Entire international frameworks are built on this foundation. Organizations like the International Commission on Radiological Protection and the World Health Organization base recommendations on conservative risk estimates derived from the LNT model. Why? Because when the potential outcome is cancer, caution is rational. Now imagine what happens if Hormesis is validated. If small doses are not merely harmless but possibly beneficial. Suddenly, cleanup standards after nuclear accidents might be re-evaluated. Some areas deemed unsafe could be reconsidered. Medical imaging risk calculations might shift. Public fear surrounding tiny exposures could decrease. That is not a minor adjustment. That is a societal transformation. And here's the uncomfortable truth. If regulators are wrong in assuming harm at low doses, the cost is economic. Stricter cleanup, higher compliance expenses, possibly unnecessary evacuations. But if regulators are wrong in assuming safety, the cost is human lives. That asymmetry matters. Radiation is invisible, odorless, intangible. When harm appears years later, it is difficult to trace with perfect certainty. So policymakers lean toward the safer side of uncertainty, not because Hormesis has been disproven, but because the consequences of underestimating risk are irreversible. There is also history to consider. Events like Chernobyl and Fukushima left deep psychological and political scars. Public trust was shaken. Fear became embedded. In such an environment, proposing that some radiation might be good sounds reckless, even if the science is nuanced. And science does not operate in isolation. It interacts with politics, with public perception, with ethical responsibility. Researchers who support hormesis often argue that fear of radiation may itself cause harm through stress, forced relocation, and economic collapse. Opponents argue that loosening standards could normalize exposure and increase cumulative risk. Both sides claim to protect human health. Both believe caution is justified, but they define caution differently. At its core, this controversy is not just about biology. It is about risk tolerance. It is about how societies handle uncertainty. And it is about a fundamental tension in science. Do we protect people from hypothetical small risks at all costs, or do we update policy only when evidence becomes overwhelming? Radiation hormesis sits precisely in that tension, not fully accepted, not fully dismissed, and until the evidence becomes decisive, the world will continue to choose safety first. Not because science is closed to new ideas, but because when the stakes are this high, being wrong is not theoretical, it is permanent. So, after all of this, is radiation good for you? Here is the honest answer. We don't know for sure. High doses of radiation? Absolutely harmful. That is not debated. When exposure overwhelms the body's repair systems, damage accumulates, cells malfunction. Cancer risk rises. That part is clear. But at very low doses, the kind we encounter naturally every day, the picture becomes less certain. Some evidence suggests possible harm. Some suggest no measurable effect. Some suggest the possibility of mild benefit. And science has not reached full consensus. That uncertainty can feel uncomfortable. We prefer simple answers. Black or white. Safe or dangerous. But biology rarely operates in straight lines. Your body is not passive. It is dynamic, adaptive, resilient. Every day, your cells repair thousands of tiny DNA errors. Every day, your immune system eliminates abnormal cells. Every day, complex defense systems operate quietly beneath your awareness. The idea of radiation hormesis does not claim radiation is good in a casual sense. It suggests something more subtle, that small challenges in the right dose may stimulate protective responses. Just as exercise stresses muscle to build strength, just as fasting triggers cellular cleanup, just as exposure to sunlight allows the production of vitamin D. But here is the key. Dose matters. Context matters. And humility matters. Until stronger evidence emerges, caution remains wise. Not fear, not panic, but informed respect. Radiation is neither a villain nor a miracle.